Where did I put my notes? There they are. Yep.
And I'll try and turn this around and get it online so it comes out at some point, either later tonight or early tomorrow.
Yeah, there's no panic. There's no panic. Whenever it works, if it doesn't work, we can just do it again. Yeah, so.
Like we're doing in the podcast.
Design of the carriers.
Design of the carriers. It's always a fun topic.
Well, you did sort of raise a few points that lifted my eyebrow. The concept of the striker carrier and the battle carrier. Well, I think I can see where you're coming from.
Of the concepts, there's the cruiser carrier, and that's
the cruiser carrier. Yes.
Carrier. So the Royal Navy is basically looking at. It's all part of the Royal Navy looking at this sort of global approach and what are they going to be using their forces for. And it's very much they're looking at the other navies and they're going, "You're thinking about fighting a war, or fighting battles. That's lovely," but they're thinking about fighting a war. So what do they need in battles? Well, they need a carrier which is going to be close to the battle group, is their theory, so it can keep up a strike and keep up constant pressure, and while having fighter coverage for the battleships. And that's got to be the battle carrier. That's got to be armored. That's got to be, to an extent, protected enough that it can be as close to the front line of a fighting as possible. It's not going to be right on the front line, although do not tell that to HMS Formidable, HMS Victorious, and HMS Illustrious, which all three tried to on regular occasions, and were very disappointed when they were told they had to go back by the battleships.
And or get repaired afterwards.
Yes. But let's put it this way: there are certain classes which do not understand this concept of them being they're not supposed to be in the front line. Okay.
Yes.
And so you have that sort of and you have the bigger strike carrier, literally because the Royal Navy doesn't want a fleet hiding in sea, but also they want to keep another carrier back because they're very much thinking about, right then, so we'll have these carriers close, but this other carrier, we can keep that further away, keep it moving around, so that if you find us, you won't necessarily find it. And that will be the unknown strike package.
Now, of course, that was the
battles, and it's the cruiser carriers which are going to be backing up the cruisers and, doing the commerce war.
Trade protection, yes. I mean, okay, that's also the doctrine that Japan came up with after, or adapted after Midway, or attempted to adopt. But at the same time, I'm not really seeing any sign of these strike carriers in the naval construction lists. I mean, we're seeing Ark Royal.
Yes.
Then we're seeing the 6 Illustriouses, which come in subgroups, but they were all built. They were all laid down before World War II.
Think about two of them.
Yeah, well, you've got Indomitable and Indefatigable. Sorry, Implacable and Indefatigable, but they are still basically indomitable hulls that have been refined and stretched somewhat. They're not exactly substantially different. So in my mind, I've always grouped them.
They're not substantially different, but what they are is, it's going to sound sorry. Okay, so the idea was, once you're free of the treaty, why do I build a strike carrier which has no armor when I can extend and elongate the illustrious, the armored design, the battle design, and can get a carrier which can do both? So
again, I'm going to argue here. Why then would you keep the Implacables as basically treaty weights in that case? Because they weren't given much extra tonnage over the that of the Implacable anyway. So
it's basically speed of construction. It's they're trying to get them out as quickly as they can do once they start them up building again, but they also want to build them to. And one of the interesting things I find is that I can almost go back to the 1934 X design and go through that, and that was designed originally as there was one version put together as the hybrid strike and armoured carrier combined, which was what the Royal Navy would really have all wanted. If they'd had the choice, they'd have had all carriers built to this sort of combined standard.
Essentially the Audacious, really.
Yeah.
Is Audacious the embodiment of Design X, do you think?
Yes. So basically, that would have been their dream to have always built. But under treaty standards, they couldn't get their dream. So they went, right then, what's the next best thing? Well, we want at least 4 or 6 battle carriers and up to 3 strike carriers. So we'll build a strike carrier because we've still got Courageous and Glorious around. So you don't need to build the strike carriers that soon.
Straight away.
You need another one because Furious is getting old, and that's always something you're going to worry about. But you can build Ark Royal, and that will give you the strike coverage you need and time you need. And then you start building the battle carriers. And then so the battle carriers, the illustrious class, are the ones on the stocks. So if you're going to adapt the design and start building it quickly, you adapt the design you've got under construction. And also, by about that point, the Ark Royal design really wasn't. Let's put it this way: they had enough experience with the armor. They went, if we can put in the armor, we're going to have it there on the strength deck because this strength deck is useful. And what people often forget is the armor doesn't just go on the strength deck. There is also thicker plating between the hangar and the ship because they turn every deck into a strength deck. And now remember, the definition of a strength deck is when you put in enough steel rigidity into that hull, into that deck, that it can hold up the sides of the hull. If it's just wooden planks on a steel hull, it won't do anything. But if you do have every single level have that rigidity, you're making the hull much, much stronger. You're also making it take far more damage and spread the load more. So you can put armor on the different levels, and it can be different types of armor. Because you might put conventional armor plating on underneath the flight deck, but then you might just put thicker steel on the next deck down, which isn't as dense or as heavy as the armor, but will do almost as good a job, especially as anything coming through has had to punch through that armor and then will have to hit the deck below. So it'll be losing velocity anyway. And these calculations are all being done. And one of the things I find interesting is the amount of stuff which is developed pre-war, and it goes against quite a lot of the standard idea, which is that this stuff all comes about in wartime. It's all wartime innovation. And I look at the quality of the drawings and the things coming through, and I look at all the volume of work they're dealing with, and I go, okay, yes, this might be a new drawing, but it's going to have large chunks which are taken from the previous designs, and it's going to, in the case of the Audacious class, colossal chunks taken from the previous designs. And then you've got the light fleet carriers, which are basically HMS Unicorn modified. And I'm not even quite sure how modified they could be, arguably.
In terms of doctrine, though, of course, you have the 2-year delay spanner thrown in the works of the rush to build escorts for the Atlantic War, the Atlantic battles. So that didn't only delay Implacable and Indefatigable, it also delayed the Audaciouses. So I guess that's why you don't see this doctrine come together, dovetail together neatly during World War II.
It's basically, World War II happens, the estimates they had, and the thing is, one of the things which is really sort of depend on this all really coming together even in peacetime in a neat fashion is probably Henderson, that's the third Sea Lord, staying around and the like. And remember, he was supposed to go out and take command of one of the big fleets. That was what he was going to be sent to. I have a feeling with the way things were, they might have kept him closer and given him the Mediterranean, but he would have been quite happy with the Far East. And he was both a Mediterranean and a Far East specialist. And in 1939, both Admiral Noble in the China Squadron and Admiral Cunningham in the Mediterranean were getting close to the point at which they were going to be replaced. So they were both sort of looking about 1940, and that was when Henderson was supposed to, after 6 years in, nearly 7 years in post, was supposed to finally properly step down and go and get command, because the Navy didn't want to lose him. He was very useful, and they knew if they didn't give him another command, they couldn't keep him around or promote him to First Sea Lord. And they wanted him to come back as First Sea Lord because he managed to get the fleet built. And this was something. The Royal Navy had spent most of the 1920s and early 1930s, arguing for a coherent fleet to be built. This guy becomes Third Sea Lord, and he's able to articulate and make a case. And he's able to help the First Sea Lord and advise all them in how to get these things made. And he gets, the example I always give is HMS Unicorn, which is the whole way through called not a carrier. We've all seen HMS Unicorn. But that, according to all the official reports, when it's being built, is not an aircraft carrier. It's a forward aviation support ship. And literally everyone seems to accept that. So this is a person who can literally make people see a horse when they're looking at a unicorn.
But would have he been able to get the Audacious and Implacable built earlier or not?
Yeah.
You think so? You're pressing. You're still fighting the Battle of the Atlantic. We're talking starvation level supplies here, arriving in the UK.
If you've got World War II going on, that's always going to change things, because that means you start fighting, and you have to deal with the short term. And trust me, Henderson is, again, the plans which they do, the things they stop, are part of a ready process. They don't just suddenly go, we're going to crash stop them, and don't have a plan in place. They do have plans in place for if war breaks out. But when they're building and they're talking about these classes, they're looking at a war that they were thinking they're going to have to fight in 1942, 43, 44. They thought they had another few years. And that's what they're looking at. And especially against Japan, but also against Italy and Germany, they thought they had a few years, because they were tracking those nations' rearmaments programs.
Yes.
And the trouble is, you have the one problem that the Royal Navy has, and all nations have this. They are tracking a rearmament program, and they're basing it on a logic. Sorry. They're basing it on the logic of looking at that rearmament program and seeing what's going to happen to it, seeing what is it going to be doing. And, you know, they sit there and go, well, they're going to have their rearmament programs ready at this point, so that must be when they're planning on war. They don't they can't think, well, hang on, we have to be ready tomorrow because the politicians might go completely nuts. They can't do that one. They can't argue that one in the face of the Treasury, in the face of their own government. They have to be able to go, look, these countries are preparing for war by this date. This is what we need to do this. And they are talking about completely rebuilding the entire carrier arm of the Royal Navy. If you look at those ships they're planning, they are replacing every single carrier in the fleet. That is what their plan they're looking at. They are talking about replacing a massive amount of the cruisers. They are replacing a massive amount of the destroyers. They are talking about replacing pretty much the entire battle fleet. And the Royal Navy's planning on trying to do this in as close to a decade as possible. A humongous capital expenditure, because they are sure the war's going to be happening in the mid to late 1940s.
And they get halfway through it.
Yeah. They've got all the plans in place. They've got all that stuff there. And this is why, another reason why I say, look, in World War II, what the Royal Navy does is it goes, oh, we have these plans already, let's build from them. They're already worked out. They're already designed to our type of operation, our plan, a concept of operations. And they keep very much to their concept of operations. So, you know, you look at what they're doing in the Pacific when they're out there as the British Pacific Fleet, and you look at how they're acting. And yes, they do take some ideas from the Americans, and they do borrow from the USN, but also some of those ideas the Americans have been using have come from the handbook which the British developed in the 1920s and 30s and had given to them at the beginning of the war, because the Americans weren't as experienced in multi-carrier operations. So the British had given them a handbook and basically gone, look, we've been doing this in exercises for years, here, have this. And the Americans went, great, ran with it, developed it a bit through war experience, and then hand it back to the Brits. So you look at those designs, people go, oh, that was all the American ideas. You go, hey, yeah, the Americans have developed and have added their own spin to it, yes.
I suspect you got a pretty hard sell on that line.
Yeah, I do have a pretty hard sell on that one. But
you're going to have to get granular level evidence for that one. But I mean, I've seen bits and pieces of it, and I can see definitely where it's coming from. The early 30s multi-carrier exercises, as you say, with Henderson and the likes, and also the response to the Abyssinian crisis. That was again a multi-carrier unit. which, by the way, emphasized the need for a unicorn because they were suddenly experienced under combat-like conditions. The attrition rate of something like 10 or 15% of aircraft per, operation through.
Brilliant! It justified Henderson getting a whole generation of light carriers. He was There are a few people who it's terrible to sound that when you've got this crisis. It's terrible for the Abyssinian people, but for the Royal Navy, that was brilliant because it allowed them to give a wake-up call to the politicians to go, in the nicest way. We know that our lovely, very good bomber service keep telling you that they are going to win wars and everything, and they might do. We can't testify they won't because we haven't tried it yet, but they can't exactly move that quickly, whereas the carriers can, so we need to support them.
Yes, and I mean, okay, well, back to that point though, the RN wasn't the only one doing these big war games. We had the fleet exercises, the fleet challenges of the United States Navy.
Yeah.
And likewise in 1929, they had a bit of a revelation, a bit of a blinding light on the road to Damascus when they had when Saratoga did the surprise strike against the was it Panama?
Yeah.
That again also opened up a whole new realm of possibilities, a whole new realm of carrier usages, and I think that was followed up over the subsequent exercises as well, with strikes on Hawaii and in following missions and dual carrier operations. So is it more a matter of is it sort of a concurrence of ideas, or is it again a difference in terms of Pacific thinking versus Atlantic Mediterranean?
No, there's a concurrence in ideas, but what you've got is a different sort of approaches on it. In that the Americans is very much focused on battle. It's very much focused. When I read it, they're very much okay. The academic in me would go Mahanian. It's a very much focused on battle, on the idea of winning the battle. You get sea control, you win the battle, and then you win the war. So you win sea control, and then you win the war.
The big battle concept.
Yes, the big battle concept. And it goes into War Plan Orange, which is their critical theory of thinking. The British one is based on 3 phases. Right then, there's the initial phase where they expect, especially if they're in the Far East, to be outnumbered, outgunned, and not have enough forces there to begin with. They just don't expect they're going to. So what are their fleet going to do? Well, any carrier out there, any cruisers out there will go on to economic warfare. Their point is to try and distract the Japanese fleet so long that it's trying to trace down these surface raiders that they can't mass and do anything. So that's why the Royal Navy prefers to have cruisers out in the Far East than battleships. You deploy battleships are these great sailor symbols, but they're actually not useful for the Far East deployment. They are not that good. What you want cruisers. You want a cruiser carrier out there to try and so the Japanese realize that okay, they might start a fight, but their fleet's going to have to spread out all over the place to try and track down these surface raiders. And it's definitely not you concentrate your cruisers into one fleet and you try and fight a pitched battle with an enemy with battleships. You don't do that. But, that's the kind of war the British are forced into fighting. And then the next phase would, of course, be the fleet turning up. And the fleet hopefully turns up in numbers. But they're preparing to fight their way through the Straits of Singapore. They do expect to have to do that. So then that's why you have the battle carriers. That's why you have those carriers with the fleet. So the fleet's able to fight through there if they're ambushed as they're coming through.
Sort of like it's the Malta convoy, but with Singapore as a destination.
Yes. And then once you're through Singapore, once you're heading up to probably Weihai Wei is going to be where their forward operating base be. And they're going to have some troops with them to seize it. They're going to be in ships which wouldn't have looked too different to landing ships large, the big landing ship infantry large, those sort of big converted liners, with probably loaded with LCUs and LCAs and those sort of the little landing craft. that the Royal Navy already had been sort of building in the 1930s. They would recapture Weihai Wei because they would probably have to take it back because they reckon the Japanese would have gone after it quite quickly, especially as that's the best British place and the British place the British best know near enough Japan to actually launch any operations from. And the strike carriers would be coming behind them. And then the strike carriers would be used to either force the Japanese fleet to come out to fight them, or take out the Japanese fleet in harbour, and then they do a blockade. And the idea was, if you could take out enough of the Japanese fleet early enough, you could actually make the war sustainable, because then you could withdraw some of your heavy assets and withdraw some of your stuff back to European theatre to keep an eye on the Germans and the Italians, who were still very much a problem. Remember, the nightmare scenario for Britain is fighting a war against Germany, Italy, and Japan at the same time. And their fear is always that Japan will start it first, and then the Germans and the Italians are opportunistic, and they will start it after them.
In the end, of course, it all ended up being the opposite way around. So.
Yeah.
And also, they didn't get to fight the war that they planned for.
No.
Which I suppose brings us to the point, how adaptable were those armoured carriers, the battle carriers, to the roles that they were thrust into?
Well, the point I'd always make is that the Royal Navy managed to use the strike carrier for the bluff at Taranto, and the armoured carrier for the actual hit. And that's the thing. You've got Ark Royal hitting Genoa, and everyone, and the Italians and the Germans go, "Where's the Ark Royal? Where's the Ark Royal?" So they don't know notice Illustrious sneaking up on them. And let's be honest, Illustrious it launches a strike. It's completely uncontested. Illustrious, it could have been a peacetime exercise. That's how little problems Illustrious had getting in there. It could have been a peacetime exercise.
Yes.
And the joke is, they actually had been doing that as peacetime exercises. They have been doing carriers getting in with range of Malta, launching long-range night strikes on Malta for about the previous 10 years in various exercises. That's how the Royal Navy was working. And that's why the Royal Navy had the Swordfish, of course, because if you're going to be flying at night and you're going to be doing a long-range strike, you want something which is easy to fly, reliable, and can carry a heavy load, so that when it gets there, it's delivered something worthwhile. And that was the Swordfish. And yes, it wasn't as good as the aircraft which came later, but when it was developed in the early 1930s, it was the bee's knees of what you needed. The fact is, though, the Royal Navy's successor, which they planned to get into service, was a bit naff.
The poor old Albacore, yeah. That didn't have the reliability.
It wasn't just the Albacore. It was there was about 2 other aircraft as well. I've got them listed in my folder somewhere from my presentations, which came in after the Swordfish and just quietly disappear. Basically, they come in as Mark 1 just after the Swordfish Mark 1 has come in, and just within a year. And then when the Swordfish Mark 2 comes up, and they just go bye-bye. And they're in service for about 2 years. One of them, actually, on the performance systems, you'd think would be better than the Swordfish. It has a better engine, it has more lift, and all these things. It's faster, everything. It should have been better. It's not as reliable. So the Royal Navy cuts it. And that tells you what the Royal Navy's thinking about, because the Royal Navy's going, yeah, this is the aircraft which is better in every single stat apart from reliability. So that's the critical thing for their operations.
So after we lose Courageous and Glorious in 39-40, the only real, opportunity to do a multi-carrier operation is kind of thrust upon the Royal Navy in 1942 April, and Operation C. So here is the clash that they had been planning for since the early 30s.
Yeah.
Difficult situation. I mean, okay, let's face it, it was only 2 aircraft carriers in terms of Indomitable and Formidable, and it was up against 5 out of the 6 coup de bataille carriers. This is not exactly an ideal face-off, I suppose.
No, but also you have. Well, I think I'm probably slightly harsher on Somerville than you are. Although I say he just had run out of luck and run out of energy by that time. He just wasn't lucky. And that's the thing. He has run out of energy and luck.
He'd only actually been there a couple of weeks.
Yeah.
He literally arrived aboard Formidable and hadn't even pulled into Colombo yet. He met up with his forces. Oh, sorry, he hadn't he? Pulled into Colombo for a couple of days. Hadn't met half his force captains. Hadn't met the ships hadn't pulled together until he basically ran south. So, it's not exactly ideal.
No, and I'm sitting there looking at the officers, and there's part of me which would okay, if you'd been lucky, you'd have had someone like Henderson or Lister available, alive, available to do that. And honestly, I think if you're going to have a carrier battle down there, you should have probably had Lister go out and Lister be in charge. Because he's, after Henderson goes, he becomes the father figure for naval aviation. He is the guy who ran the attack on Taranto. He's the former rear admiral aircraft carriers. He is senior enough. He could have been sent, but he's back being 5th Sea Lord. And of course he's 5th Sea Lord because the Royal Navy is currently having to grow its air arms. So he's really essential where he is. But he is taken out for Operation Pedestal. So if he can be taken out for Operation Pedestal, why couldn't he be sent? But no.
Probably because Pedestal had a slightly more organised run-up than Operation C.
Yeah.
So.
But no, you have Operation C. Okay, yes, they could have done with an extra carrier. If they'd had a third carrier, it would have definitely been more of a matchup. And losing Courageous and Glorious, that's been a big loss for the Navy. That has caused a complete rebalance of the fleet and where they are, etc. Because if you imagine, if you had even one of those carriers still in service, there would have been a third carrier.
Yeah.
It might
and it would have been your strike carrier.
There would have been a strike carrier. There would have been one with a heavier fighter with a heavier load. So you would have had a multi-carrier, three-carrier force. But what he does start doing the right things, and I do like the way he organises his forces, and he does try his best. But
he also had very poor intelligence, didn't he? He didn't know how many carriers there were. One of the Catalinas that was shot down managed to get out a partial sighting report. That Catalina only saw a couple carriers. He didn't realise that there were 5. At best, he thought there were 2. He suspected there was more, but he had only heard of 2. So I guess he was hedging his bets when he was attempting the night conflict, the night engagement.
And the night engagement is right out of the British textbook, because also they know the Japanese are no good at night flying. They know. They have been watching Japanese exercises for the last 20 years. They have seen the Japanese exercise. The Japanese don't do night flying at this point. And they have a few pilots who would be trying, but whereas the entire fleet air arm is night qualified, then they make a massive effort to make sure they are night qualified. The Japanese aren't, and there's good reasons not to be. It's very difficult. It's very taxing, and it's actually very deadly training pilots to land on aircraft carriers at night in this time. Even when you've got beacons, even when you've got lights, all these things. And also, there's the fact that when you are doing night flying, you do have to turn on lights, which do illustrate where your carrier is in the middle of the ocean. You have to do it. Otherwise, the aircraft won't be able to land. And the British consider night flying an advantage. It justifies that. But you can understand other navies which have made that decision not to. But, and I will start cross-examining you on this one as well, because it's not just going to be entirely an interview of me, as much as it's your happy place.
Well, the 1930s is the pre-war planning is your speciality.
Yeah.
And I guess I've sort of done most of my reading based on the eventualities of the war, and I don't have a lot of the context that you bring to it. So,
well,
I'm already seeing I'm going to have to revisit some of my.
To get into this one with Somerville, he's trying to plan out of the textbook. But the thing is, he's not seeing what I would have been doing, and what I think from some of the reports which go through and some of the stuff you see looking at it in the Navy at the time, the general consensus is that the Somerville at the beginning of the war, and especially of Force H, was always prepared to go with the doctrine or to forget the doctrine and try a new plan when he felt it was not necessary and try something else. But as the war goes on, he gets more and more tired and he gets more and more worn out. And you can understand that command is a tremendous strain. You know, I can talk about Philip Vian later in the war. I can talk about all sorts of officers through the war who do a long-term command, and the personality you're sort of dealing with at the end is not necessarily the personality you have at the beginning. And they get far, the question is, how does that personality affect their command? Does it affect them in a sort of personal way? Are they seen as a nicer or as a quieter person? Stanley Goodall, the great naval architect, the one who's the director of naval construction and those sort of things. He starts off the war being considered a lovely, wonderful, personal gentleman. Very friendly by everyone. Admittedly, one of his best friends is Admiral Henderson, who's the third SEAL all the time. Of course, Henderson dies in 1939. Stanley Goodall takes on all the operations. By the end of the war, he's still considered a kindly man, but he's also considered a very austere man who doesn't joke, who doesn't smile. And he's run a war which has been seen 700 designs go through his design office, all sorts of things. And that's the effect it's had on him. He's still churning out excellent designs, but he's lost that personality. You can say with Philip Vian, he's the hero of the destroyer force, but when he gets into the carrier force, he's not so good at projecting his personality wider. His personality's become more internal. So the people who personally work with him say how lovely and friendly he is. And of course, he does things like he's always hunting down any pilot who goes down, aircrew goes is down, he tries his best to recover them. These sort of things. This is the original Philip Vian. But he's not so good at projecting that personality, that kindly nature, around his wider force, which he did so well in the tribals at the beginning of the World War II. But he's still good at making decisions and command. I would say the trouble with Somerville is that he keeps the personality. You can see that because of the way he managed to work on Ernie King and actually makes the USN CNO, Admiral King, of course, famously was not that keen on Brits. He loved Somerville. They were very, very good pals by the end of Somerville's time in Washington. So he's kept but he loses his command edge, if anything. He loses the ability to trust himself outside of doctrine. So he's trying to do the doctrine and pure doctrine in a situation which, in a nicer way, he hasn't got the strike carrier. He hasn't got the things which would have made that doctrine work in that scenario. So you need to either adapt the doctrine or come up with a new doctrine. And it's the confidence to make those decisions. And then you've got, so you see, this is why I say Somerville's good, and he doesn't do anything necessarily wrong, especially according to doctrine, but he doesn't do what Somerville could have done earlier in the war and would have done earlier in the war. And I sit there and I'm looking at it thinking, actually, if I'd been going, as I said, Lumley Lister, definitely I'd have sent out some. I might have sent out Harwood, actually, as well. Although he's very junior, he's only a rear admiral at this point, I think. But Harwood is, again, an officer who thinks outside the box. And actually, keeping him as far away from the Army and the RAF and inter-service politics is probably a good thing for Harwood's career, considering that's what really mucks him up. There are a few officers sitting around who are quite good, who could have been sent instead of Somerville. But Somerville's sent because of his reputation from Force H. The trouble is they're not getting the Force H Somerville. They're getting the post-Force H Somerville. And he has used up so much energy, so much, that it's not the same Somerville.
Yeah, I mean, I can see what you're saying, but also I'm just looking at the circumstances. You know, he's there 1 week.
Yeah.
He's there with a very green carrier in the form of HMS Formidable after she came back from repairs. Aircrew had barely worked up on the deck.
Mm-hmm.
And as I said, basically your cruiser trade protection, trade warfare force suddenly having to pull together to work as a fleet unit, which they hadn't done since 1939. So, you're talking, it's not, I'm seeing a lot of things that are pretty much impossible to pull together in that sort of time frame in order to take a risk, in order to take a doctrinal leap. But before we go on, I suppose we actually should explain, and you might want to edit this back in a little bit earlier, what is Operation C. And Operation C is, of course, the Japanese foray into the Indian Ocean by its pretty much its entire carrier force. The only carrier that wasn't there was Clarke after it had run onto a rock. And it pretty much came in and stomped over Ceylon.
Or Sri Lanka, as we now call it.
Yes, I suppose I should try and remember that as well. But
I always add in both, because I always tell people both when I'm doing the lectures, because I go, well, countries, nations change for very good reasons. But B, you need to know both, because in some of the old sources which are written in a period, they'll refer to it as one thing. But if you're looking for those factors these days, you often find them in the libraries under the new name.
Yes. Well, anyway, Nagumo was there to destroy the British Indian Ocean Fleet.
Yeah.
He was there to destroy the Eastern Fleet. That was his sole purpose. Smacking around Ceylon, Sri Lanka, was basically his way of trying to draw the British out to fight.
Oh, yes.
Now, the Royal Navy got lucky with quite several intercepts of key messages, which told them that the Japanese carrier force is on the way, but it was a few days out in terms of the day that it was expected to arrive. Well, actually, no, it was correct the first time. It was correct at first, but Nagumo was running late. But the cryptologists missed the revised schedule. So, Somerville was out there and he was ready. He's got his two carriers working together. In a hurry. He's got on board them a whole bunch of albacores with ASV, air surface radar. They'd even pulled in a swordfish from a reserve that still had its air surface radar on board, because obviously they were thinking in terms of what the Royal Navy had practiced, night combat.
Swordfish from the anti-submarine force based in Ceylon?
I believe so, but I haven't really gone far enough into it. But my understanding is yes, because I have seen that mentioned, but I haven't seen it confirmed. I've also seen a mention that it was actually stowed away as spares on Indomitable and reassembled. But so I'm going to have to check that one a bit further, I guess. But,
I think there were quite a few swordfish going around. I know historically we talk usually about one, but it's going to sound strange. My experience, especially with the operations which resulted in Toronto and other things, means that the Royal Navy seems to produce swordfish torpedo bombers, TSRs, from all sorts of places whenever they need them. And it's kind of like the naval equivalent of I don't know, the knitting lady and gent, or a gent who always stores their spare threads, even a little bit of thread left, just in case they need it. You find these swordfish pop out from everywhere. This is throughout the entire Second World War. Suddenly you go, our carrier strikes groups down. We don't have this. Don't worry, we have a couple of swordfish aboard. And going, swordfish aren't anymore. They're not supposed
if you had a
yeah.
If you had a radar-equipped swordfish, you wouldn't be chucking it into the scrap heap anyway. You'd be using it, as you say, for anti-submarine patrol from harbour if necessary. So yeah, it makes sense that there was one around somewhere. Regardless, and on board you had Fulmars, which are also, night qualified, night capable, night as I had proven, tracking Bismarck in the horrible weather and at night. So he'd by this stage seen that the night concept had been proven, and he'd also had this nice new toy radar there, which apparently he had been given a very dramatic demonstration of, flying on board a radar-equipped aircraft. I think it might have been a Swordfish, could have been an Albacore. After getting his testicles fried by electrical short, The observer managed to guide him right over the top of his own flagship in the middle of heavy cloud, which was Renown, and he just basically brought the aircraft down on top of Renown, and from that point he was supposedly sold on the idea of radar on the aircraft. So yeah, they had those things there, but it was still patchy. There was some sea hurricanes, there were some martlets. It was all a bit of a mess in terms of the carrier air group.
I do agree, which is why I can understand. Look, he's planning his operation for a night attack and these sort of things, and yes, the timings go out, and there are all sorts of good reasons that he doesn't do what is it. This is why I don't say he's a bad admiral. This is why I say he's an unlucky admiral, and at this point, and he's not the full Somerville of Force H. Because if you consider what he'd have done earlier in the war, when he was faced with similar issues, and he had faced similar issues of a fleet he wasn't sure where they were, what they were doing, and he's supposed to go now. And Force H, when it comes together, is not much more than a disparate group, and he brings that together fairly quickly. But that's why the Royal Navy did the major exercises every year it had done for the previous years. So that even if you had to do it, bring a fleet together quickly, yes, they might not have worked up with a fleet recently in that individual ship, but a large majority of the senior officers and senior NCOs would have done many, many fleet exercises. So in the nicest way, those ships could work together pretty quickly, pretty well. Okay, it wasn't going to be perfect, but it's not as if those ships hadn't taken part in major exercises, hadn't been part of those things many years ago. And also their captains, their executive officers, most of their senior lieutenants will have done many, many exercises. And that's why the Royal Navy worked as it did. And
ultimately, though, there we are on the I forget the specific night, but you have the British carrier force and the Japanese carrier force 100 miles apart from each other.
Yeah.
And you have a couple of albacores getting shot down, and one or two getting back in rather bedraggled state to give their sighting reports. And unfortunately, one of those sighting reports was made either a little bit too early, i.e. just before the Nagumo's force turned around and started heading off in the opposite direction, or it gave a reciprocal sighting report through a mistake, which is not unknown. And they miss each other at night. But it basically, he was in position, ready to go, ready to make that, to do that fight. It's basically only the next day that the details come through that actually, no, there aren't two carriers in that Japanese force, there's 5. And it's then that he decides, nah, I think I'm not going to try it again. So,
here's the thing. Imagine if he had hit that night and had taken out any of those carriers, or considering Royal Navy doctrine was to always head for the carriers in a night strike. Imagine he'd taken out 3 or 4 of those carriers. And with the big torpedoes and the way the Royal Navy practiced night strikes, and also, nice way, the Japanese air defenses and things at night, they didn't really have that effective radar. I don't think that actually, I'm not sure if that task group actually had any radar in it. It might have had.
I don't think they did at that stage.
No, but I don't think they did. No, none of the ships with radar were in that force. So night fight, and for the swordfish on the albacores, that would have been blooming brilliant. There's nothing to fight back at us. They're just firing machine guns wildly in the air. We'll take that any day of the week. So that sort of that kind of scenario, they're going in, they take a. Imagine the Americans' reaction if the Royal Navy had sunk the carriers which destroyed Pearl Harbor. I don't think Admirals were like Somerville then.
I think this is one of those scenarios where we're going to have to definitely try and get a higher resolution war game set up to see what the potential is.
Yes, a high resolution war game, but also the politics side of the Americans going, we hate. Oh, it would have been great for the Royal Navy. It would have been the new.
Yeah, but also it could have easily have gone the other way. Let's face it, they only had one decent battleship force fight. The 2R class were in Group B, bringing up the rear because they were so slow, and because they basically didn't have enough distilled water to keep their condensers operating, to keep their engines running. It still was very much a David versus Goliath scenario.
Oh yes, but if you take out those carriers, you do have the advantage that he can stay in range and just go, what can you do? In nicest way. Even if he doesn't take out all those carriers, you take out enough of those carriers, you're going to damage that force's ability to structure, and then you hold off for a day. You keep as far back as you can. And the Royal Navy does have radar-directed fighters, and Martlets and Sea Hurricanes, they might not look like much, but them and Fulmars are all fairly good at the interception thing, which is going to put off any strike force. They might not be able to toe-to-toe on a nice spreadsheet. They don't go might not match up against the idea of a perfect zero engagement, but let's be honest. If you're in any of those three aircraft, you're far more likely to survive being hit than you are in a zero, and they've got some pretty heavy machine guns and heavy firepower in them. So they've got firepower. They might not have speed or turning ability, but they certainly do have firepower.
And radar guidance, yes.
Yes. In nicest way, Somerville could have unknowingly, and without realizing it, have won a second Battle of Trafalgar because he only thought he was taking on 2 carriers. And when he finds out he's taking on 5, he then goes, aha! But this is the point again.
Or he could have lost, also could have lost 2 of the Royal Navy's only 3 modern surviving carriers.
Yes, and one of the critical battleships. He could have lost quite a lot of force. But the point I would make is, yes, he could have lost them, but the entire doctrine, as the Royal Navy had drummed into him, and was to go back and attack at night, to offset the numerical advantage. Because remember, Phase 1, they always thought they were going to be fighting initially in numerical disadvantage, and they actually thought, honestly, in the transition of Phase 2, when they're going through the Straits of Singapore, they thought they would probably meet a mass Japanese navy down there. They did. That was one of their big things. They thought they'd end up fighting a battle in a confined space, because if they were the Japanese, that's what they would have done. Get them in a confined space and funnel them into submarines, into carrier strike, into everything, and smash them. The Royal Navy is pretty brutal when it comes to war fighting, and this is, brutal but efficient. But this is where Somerville loses support, and he loses in a nice way support in the wider Navy as well on this front. Because if you think about the wider Royal Navy, you've got HMS Glowworm, which does a destroyer which doesn't hesitate to try and take on Admiral Hipper despite being solo. Takes on 2 destroyers bigger than her, and it takes them on. You've got HMS Renown, which goes toe-to-toe with Scharnhorst and Eisenhower, doesn't back down. You've got an entire Navy which is built on the thing that if you see the enemy, you attack. This is why Craddock doesn't get into trouble, isn't posthumously vilified after Cornell. He did the right thing. This is why HMS Rawalpindi is remembered so well. Yes, she gets sunk, but she charged Scharnhorst and Eisenhower, and she fought.
But there's a significant difference there between those individual warships or individual squadrons and 2/3 of the Royal Navy surviving carrier force.
To be honest, yes, but there isn't. I can understand Somerville's mindset. This is why he's not censored. I don't consider him. He doesn't do anything bad. He's just unlucky and isn't the full Somerville. But the trouble is, if you turned around and you put Cunningham in that position, or you put Harwood in that position at that time, or you put Philip Vian in that position, can you imagine any of those three thinking, I'm commanding only 2/3 of the Royal Navy's carrier force, my job is to preserve them, not to sink the enemy? Or can you imagine them all thinking, right then, so we've got this opportunity, they can't do this at night, I have to hide during the day, but I have to find them again tonight, and then I have to take out as many of those carriers as I can.
Well, I guess that's always going to be hanging in the air, isn't it, that question?
That is. The thing is, this is why I say he doesn't do anything wrong. I can understand the reason of his arguments and all these things. They are legitimate arguments, they are legitimate points, and he's making it. But also, can you imagine the Somerville of January 1940 or maybe even May 1940. Can you imagine him making that decision and not going on the attack the next night? No. Somerville then was very aggressive himself and would have done it. I think what you've got there is you've got an officer who is a very good officer, who's making a legitimate decision and he's doing a very correct decision, but he's not doing the right correct decision for what the Royal Navy wanted. And this is why he could have been given more command, he could have been given more afterwards. But in the nicest way, as soon as the legitimate reason is found to replace him and move him on, he has moved to very much a shore posting. He has moved away from it.
Yep.
And it goes back to the point, as I said, command and keep being command does affect officers differently. And the Royal Navy knows it's not going to win a war in nicest way by acting safely. The Royal Navy has a long history and has this built in. If you consider what happens in World War II, it's the Germans and the Italians, and to an extent the Japanese, but less so the Japanese, who are worried about risking their ships. And they hold their punches and pull their punches because they don't want to lose their ships. The Royal Navy, if it's pulling its punches because it's worried about losing ships, it's not coming from the senior officer. It's not often, it doesn't come from the government, and it doesn't really come from the Royal Navy's chain of command. When an officer does it, they're understood, but they tend to find themselves quietly sidelined. Because the Royal Navy, you don't get naval supremacy, you don't get control world, you don't get the world's largest empire based on naval power by pulling your punches because you're afraid of losing ships. Even if they are critical ships, you don't do it because, in much this way, once you lose that naval supremacy, you've lost your empire. You've lost your reason for having a navy in so many ways as far as navies are concerned. So actually, here's the other thing. Is Operation C, and this point, the beginning of the end for the British Empire? Because if he hadn't pulled his punch, and if he had successfully managed to take out even the Japanese carriers, that puts the British back in the ball game in the Pacific War, because they're the ones who've taken out the Japanese carriers, not the Americans. Instead of Coral Sea and Midway being the big naval battles, suddenly you've got the Indian Ocean. The British took out the Japanese carriers, and the British get in, and the British at this time still have more naval forces than the Americans. So then the British are leading in the Pacific War, and then you get a whole new conundrum starts happening of what does the world look like post-Second World War under that scenario. So this is arguably one of the biggest turning points for the world which comes after World War II, is this battle, and is Somerville, in the nicest way, pulling his punches.
Interesting point.
I can understand why he did it, but I also have this feeling that a lot of the other Royal Navy officers, if they be several of the Royal Navy officers, if they've been very long time, and remember, it's not just him who's suffering from the war. Several of them would have been wouldn't have done the same thing. Yeah. And you have what I often think is the pressure of command is either changing your personality in terms of you become less personable and you sort of become more sort of introverted, but you're still able to exercise command, or you keep your personality and you become more and more conservative in your command decisions. Because that's how I see it goes. I'm not sure, I can't say this for everyone, but that's when I'm looking at it, that's what I see broadly happens in the officers. You have Vian, Cunningham, you have the Director of Naval Construction, Stanley Goodall, who become slightly more, less such big personalities. They're still personal, they're still friendly on the individual level, but in terms of their fleets, they're not that big, fatherly figure. But Somerville is still very much a very good, very nice, very kind, very bubbly, lovely figure. But in his command decisions, he's becoming more and more conservative.
All right, so Operation C was a pivotal point for the future of the Empire.
Mm-hmm.
Abyssinian crisis, what sort of pivotal role did that play in the designs of the carriers? Or is that sort of overrated?
I think the Abyssinian crisis can be overrated in terms of its effect on the actual design, because the design was going that way anyway. But I think, and I am going to start asking you questions in a second. You're not going to let you get away this for the whole time. As much as I realise it is your happy place, but what it does do is it provides justification in terms of them doing the things they wanted to do. It's one of those things that the Abyssinian crisis allows those in charge of Royal Navy construction to really go, look, we need us. We've been making this case already, we've heard us make this case. Well, if you needed any proof, here's the Abyssinian crisis. And the British government suddenly has to go, yeah.
Okay, so then the next point is design. We've got the battle carriers. We've got the design concepts finally made whole, put into form in steel and armor. Mm-hmm. The big criticism, I suppose, that is always being raised with me is, yes, but what about their metacentric height? They are so top heavy. It's a bit hard to judge because, again, based only on personal accounts, which is always a bit risky. People were saying, well, they were plenty stable enough. But then again, you look at a ship like the only real test that I can see was when Indomitable was torpedoed in Operation Husky, and pretty much immediately went to an 11-degree list. That captain didn't like the idea of not counter-flooding. So he did what the enemy was wanting him to do, so he let in water. And the ship got back up onto an even keel and made its way home, of course. But, we're talking an immediate sudden list of 11 degrees, which isn't minor. And, there's an awful lot of top weight there.
Yeah.
Yep.
The point is, there is an awful lot of top weight. And yes, that affects the metacentric height. But in the nicest way, you have that top weight for a reason. And you deal with it. Yeah. It's one of the interesting things I find when I'm looking at design, and my dad was, of course, a naval architect, and so I've spent my life around people like that, and I'm still friends with a lot of his friends, and still chat with them quite a lot. The whole point of the thing is, why has it got that top weight? It's got that top weight because that protects the ships from having, and the ship's aircraft and the purpose of the ship. So you have that top weight for a reason, so then you design around it. And you design to make it work. And unfortunately, where that torpedo particularly hit was a particularly annoying place for the balancing act. And the whole counter-flooding thing, I always think it's a good job in some respects that Henderson did die when he did. Because I have a feeling if he'd ever heard an officer say that in his presence, they might have found him doing an Admiral Duncan with their neck. Because if you look at all the work of Third Sea Lord and all the direct and the DMC and all the work that's been done in the Admiralty and in the direction of the construction and the design of carriers and these things, counter-flooding is part of the damage control process the whole time. It's something which you're not supposed to take lightly, which is where some of the lines in the workbook come from. It's not supposed to be done something just rashly going, oh yeah, we'll counter-flood. You're supposed to be very cautious when you're doing it, and they are very cautious when they do it. But that's not saying being cautious about doing something is not the same as not doing it. And the trouble is, some people take the caution as meaning you don't do it, i.e. you don't let water into your ship, versus the actual thing is you don't do it. There's a key phrase in that concept, in the sort of you don't let water unnecessarily. And the unnecessarily word is basically the DNC and the Third Sea Lord's officers going, you can do this, but you need to be careful when you do it, because there had been incidents where officers had been, oh yes, we must counterflood, and they'd end up the ship seesawing because they'd managed to put in so much water. So they add in, they don't do it unless it's necessary, and you get people thinking that means you don't do it at all. As I said, in nicest way, Admiral Henderson or Actually, also Admiral Fraser, the third Sea Lord, the guy who takes over after Henderson as third Sea Lord, would have both quite happily have done the full Admiral Duncan to a mutineer thing of dangling them out the window, holding them by their neck, going, "You have lost me a carrier for being stupid. You cannot read." And that's the thing. It's the unnecessary, and which you can understand them putting in because of the incidents that have happened and because of, again, you have to be very careful. If you're floating your own ship, you have to be very careful, because if you add in too much water, you can create a seesaw motion or cause electricals and all sorts of issues. There are very legitimate reasons for being cautious, but that's not the same as not doing it. And all carriers have a high metacentric height. You know, Ark Royal has, and she doesn't have arm. Every single, because the carrier has so much put so much high up. You know,
and that, of course, though, is one of the justifications for it being a structure as opposed to the strength deck. But you know, you still see Franklin healing quite heavily with her, you know, as a result of her firefighting efforts and other ships. So. Yeah, I don't know. It's just that it's one of those lines that is often thrown around, which I've not had the ability to counter argue myself because I just don't know enough about that level of engineering.
It's also like the idea of the air group size. I sit there and go, people tell me, oh yes, they have a massive these have far smaller air group, but as I always now seems to have become a meme, I've been told at some point, but I haven't seen it myself. You know, the Royal Navy are looking to do this.
Yes.
The American and Japanese are looking to do this. And there's a difference in how you're going to build. And, you know, the Royal Navy can afford to get that with their battle carriers because, as I said, the battle carriers were conceptually going to be as close to the actual battle as possible. This doesn't mean they're supposed to be taking part in it. That is again, as we said, there are some Royal Navy armoured carriers armoured hangar carriers, which do think they should be taking part in the battle line. But the vast majority understand the concept they're supposed to stay slightly further back. But it's kind of like HMS Eskimo and losing her bow in battles. There are some ships which don't understand the concept of what they're supposed to be doing all the time.
Yes. All right, so then, you know, okay, the ultimate test, I guess, is, you know, Mediterranean. And I guess Takashima Gunto. There you are. You have your armored carriers in close proximity, not necessarily right underneath, but well, except for in Illustrious's case, yes, she was right underneath. But at least by the time that Indomitable and Victorious were doing pedestal, they had the good sense of turning back at the straits, the Sicilian Straits. But you know, those are not exactly minor operations.
To be fair, Lister didn't want to turn back. If Lister had his way, he'd have gone right away through to Malta.
Yes, well, I think there would have been a few Italian torpedo boats that might have had a thing to say about that.
We got 4.5-inch guns, those torpedo boats will be fine. Yeah, you have to remember, again, this goes back to the point that the Royal Navy bake a willingness to fight battles into their officers from a very, very early on. It's a willingness to engage the enemy. And it's critical to the Royal Navy because, as I said, the Royal Navy, the Royal Navy is often smaller than other navies in terms of the local area. Even when it's the largest navy in the world, it's smaller. So it's got to achieve a level of psychological dominance, in a way, over the enemy. It's got to be the one which is, it's always got to act like it's the bigger navy, even when it's the smaller navy in a locality. It's always got to act like we are invincible, because that's how it keeps the other navies thinking about it, because the other navies going, well, if they're so confident, they must have more, they must have this, they must have, you know, that's how the Royal Navy works. Quite a lot of the war in the Mediterranean, the Royal Navy has less ships there than the Italians do. Yes, the Italians don't have an aircraft carrier and all sorts of things, but the Italians usually actually have more ships, and they're usually more concentrated than the Royal Navy's ones, which are at least spread about that direction, if not all over the place. But the Royal Navy at any point in World War II, you can never really say there's a point that the Italian Navy is morally dominant and ascendant in the Mediterranean over the Royal Navy. Because the Royal Navy might be small, but the Royal Navy is always willing to engage. You know? And part of it, they can do that because they build their ships to engage. You can argue that. And again, that goes back to the metacentric height of the armored Hagan carriers. You build your ship to fight. And you build it to take damage because it's going to take damage. That's one of the interesting things. You can you think about the Royal Navy carrier design versus the other navies. They are designing their carriers with the idea they're going to take damage and they're going to have to keep fighting the whole way through. Even Ark Royal, which of course isn't listed as an armored hangar carrier, but does have the flight deck as the strength deck, does have pretty thick steel on both that level and the hangar level. They might not be armor, but it's pretty thick steel. She is still pretty strong. She's designed to take damage and carry on and try and carry on working. You know, this is the Royal Navy they're thinking about. Their whole plan is they're going to sail into harm's way.
Ultimately, it seemed to be a pretty convincing argument because you end up seeing Taiho and Midway.
Yes, yes. They're basically everyone else copies the British, but it's that's the fun thing.
But I mean, is that true though? Because again, both Japan and the United States were doing their experiments with paper designs for armored fight deck carriers in the 30s as well. They were at least exploring these concepts in the same way that the Royal Navy was. It's just that their particular circumstances at the time didn't seem to suit that approach.
Yeah, that's definitely the case. Everyone's looking at it. You know, the thing is, every one of them has skilled naval architects who can look at it. It's only the British who plumb for it, and the British plumb for it because the British are thinking, what are we going to do? The British are thinking, we're going to be fighting on the other side of the world from where we can build ships. We're fighting from the other side of the world where we can do our major repairs on ships. So that's why the British go for the armoured. The other case, of course, is they could be fighting in the Mediterranean where there's no getting away from land bases. It just isn't. So you have a choice. The British have two scenarios where the armoured carrier makes sense. The battle carrier makes sense. You've got it in the Mediterranean, where you're surrounded, or the Far East, where you're far away from everything that can support you and repair you. So you better have a ship which is as easy to repair as possible, but is also as survivable as possible. So it's going to take the minimum amount of damage and keep its air group operating. Because to replenish the air group and replenish the ship, it's going to be difficult. So that's why the British go for it. The Americans and Japanese, I don't say they treat their carriers as disposable assets, but they are thinking about fighting that big battle. And sometimes I wonder, I look at their concepts for what they're going to be using their carriers after that big battle, and I wonder if they've really thought it through. Because most of them are sort of things like, there'll be a big battle, we'll fight the battle, where the carriers will deliver their big punches, and we'll win, and then whatever's left of the fleet will go and harry the other one's coast or something like that. And you sit there and go, are you really thinking about your ship? Are you thinking about the sheer amount of damage you're going to take in this big battle? Or are you presuming that you're going to be entirely victorious and the enemy's not?
Well, I guess certainly. I think it's that concept did sort of rely on the overwhelming victory, didn't it?
Yeah, it does. That's the thing, and it's almost the interesting thing because the Royal Navy's, I would argue, actually the more aggressive navy of the three, in its terms of the way it's teaching its officers to act and its officers to think. I would argue actually the Royal Navy is the most aggressive of the three, which again can get me into trouble, but I'm still looking at going, well, the Royal Navy is the one which is teaching its officers whatever ships you're in are the ships you go and fight with and you fight. Whereas the other navies are sort of both are far more measured, far more controlled, in a way far more centrally directed force structures in terms of their approach to fighting a naval war. if you look at the Japanese especially, that is very, very rigid in a way of its command structure. It does allow freedom of operation for captains because, honestly, in no military structure can you keep captains of ships from doing their own thing. You really can't. The moment they're in charge of a ship, they're the god on the ship, so they can do what they like. But you have far more, I would say the Japanese have far tighter control. The Americans then are slightly looser than that and getting more aggressive in some respects. And then the British are almost the loosest, going, yeah, you all know will know what you're doing. This is sort of, we'll work in this. Yes, they have task force. Yes, they have doctrine, all these things. But they have things written in there like destroyers, if they see an opportunity, can mount a torpedo attack. You have things like the box system, which they use for harrying battleships at night. Now, the box system is a pretty cool idea, but the idea is you have a destroyer take each corner of a box, and another destroyer, or possibly another 2 destroyers, hang out to fill in those spots. And those 2 officers who are hanging out, because it's at night, have got to work out if one of the corners has been taken, then take the corner, and then carry out their independent attacks in turn on the ship. This is what the Royal Navy, this is what the tribal destroyers under Philip Vian do to Bismarck all night. They've practiced this. But you've got, therefore, night command going on, where they aren't making radio signals, where they aren't flashing lights at each other, because they don't want to reveal their positions, and they keep attacking the Bismarck. You know, that's not a scenario where you're going to maintain tight or rigid control. You've got to place enormous faith in lieutenant commanders, junior officers, quite comparatively junior officers in a major situation.
And from memory, I can recall reports where Admiral Vian was often in trouble with his US liaison officers for not following such tight fleet formations with the British Pacific Fleet in the way they're supposed to move in rigid and coordinated ways. I seem to recall that one of the major complaints was he still continued to treat the carriers somewhat separately from the main body to a degree, whereas the poor old American liaison officer was going, no.
But it worked for the British way to fight. That's the thing. He treats the British carriers and the carriers as sort of separate force, but that's because, in a way, he's sitting there thinking, what are we using these assets for? What are we here for? We're here to fight. We're not here to preserve the carriers. We're here to use the carriers. We're here to use the carrier force. And it's the whole British approach. One of the interesting discussions you get between the British and the Americans over carriers, again, the British carriers are built arguably more survivable than their American counterparts, but the British are far more likely to risk them than the American counterparts. Especially by the end, especially towards the end of the war. When the Americans have more carriers coming online, they're actually starting to build more survivable carriers, the Midway class. And yeah, the British are...
They're still the ones put closest to Japan, yes.
Yeah. And the British are going, yeah. And the British are the ones who... You look at the plans for invasion of Japan, if it happens, if the nuclear bombs don't work, or the nuclear bombs aren't used, and quite a lot of those plans are basically presuming that by D+5 or D+6, the only air support you're going to get is from the British carriers. Because they're the ones which are going to still be able to be working, because they're reckoning the American carriers by that point will have been worn down by kamikazes.
I'll have to get you to supply me some of those sources so I can put that in my site.
Yeah,
a discussion for another day.
Yeah, but I've got actually the book I got that from somewhere around me, literally looking at me. I think it was this one. I think it was Reynolds. I think it's him who mentions it. But I also found it in some British books as well. And it's the typical projections, which actually I'm not sure I agree with, because they're basically presuming that the Japanese are actually going to get better at getting through the big blue blanket, which I doubt they will do. and I think there will be American carriers still around. But I also think that you can understand them presuming on this because they're looking at the way the individual carriers are performing. I also don't think the British carriers are as invulnerable as sometimes the Americans seem to market them as when they're trying to justify building the Midway class. Yes, we're justifying building the Midway class. It's their fault. They are invulnerable. Well, we've got to do, therefore, build the British carriers. And you sit there and go, they're really not. But, you know, hey ho. Yeah, it's a fun time. But, you know, as we've sort of been over, you're far more the carrier operations in World War II guy. And sort of, what do you think of what the British are getting up to?
Look, I mean, I see mostly just improvisation and necessity, because literally, as you've described, you know, this is the worst case scenario: a war on 3 fronts, which the worst case, you know. The worst plans before that was a war on 2 fronts, with, as you said, 3 being the nightmare. So, you know, as you say, the plans were there for these carriers to operate in groups, not necessarily big massed forces. I suppose in many ways, it's to me it seems as though the Royal Navy was headed down a very similar path to that of the United States, which was carriers operating, you know, a couple of carriers operating together. Now the US would operate those 2 carriers independently together, meaning that one would be just over the horizon while the other one was a little bit closer, so that if one of them spotted, then you don't lose both. But they're still essentially the one unit, whereas the Royal Navy would still have its 2 carriers in the middle of the task force, supported by the rebuilt Queen Elizabeths and the rebuilt Renown with their heavy AA outfits. So a difference there, but similar in the sense of groups of 2 or 3 carriers here operating in different locations. But of course, that very rapidly gets stripped down once you lose Courageous and Glorious, and even more so once you lose Ark Royal. And then it's basically the carriers are put where they need them the most, and you know, that's protecting the Russian convoys from, you know, is doing the classic role of the British carriers, I think, in the early war years, which is interdicting, destroying the reconnaissance and disrupting incoming. Sorry. Or cruiser carrier role, but it's the role being done by the ship that you have, because you don't have the cruiser carrier, you don't have the escort carrier, you've only got Victorious, you've only got Formidable, you've only got Illustrious. Okay, yes, you've got Furious and Argus, but you know, those are doing more, and Eagle, but those are doing more support roles, I suppose, and pressed into the front line when necessary as well. But yeah, that's basically the job that I see all 3 of those carriers doing, which is that mobile air superiority bubble over whatever is deemed to be of importance at the time. So knocking down those shadowers being the primary role, secondary role, fighters disrupting, not shooting down, but disrupting the incoming attacks. And thirdly, strikes of opportunity. You're seeing, okay, Ark Royal launches swordfish attack against Italian dams in 1940. So, you know, that's a precursor to the Dam Buster raids that everyone's forgotten about. But again, it actually happened. They ran the swordfish and dropped torpedoes against a dam because it was a target of opportunity, while Ark Royal was running along doing a convoy protection run. You see Illustrious doing similar little raids here and there. You see Formidable providing that air defense bubble for the battleships as they go and bombard Tripoli. Not to mention dropping the flares, of course, for the carrier fleet. That's pre-war doctrine, as far as I'm aware. Again, in close support of the battle fleet. And then you're seeing it attempt to do its interdiction role, which is launch an air raid against the Italian and Italian and German dive bombers, the Ju-87s at what's the name of the island just north of Crete, northeast of Crete at Scapan. Anyway, I can't think of its name.
Yeah, you and I are good at history, not always so good at geography.
Not so good at names. Anyway,
I can find the
geography's
island on a
fine.
map, but I cannot remember its name.
Anyway, that's where Formidable gets into trouble, because her Fulmars are falling out of the sky due to a lack of spare parts, thanks to the bombing raid on Coventry, and the poor old Albacores just don't really get to do much damage when they do their runs on the airfields, and Formidable takes 2 1,000-kilogram bomb hits because of it. But actually still remains operational as she returns home. She's still launching Cap again 15 minutes after taking those 2 big hits. But that's where the less than optimal situation is made evident, I suppose. When you've only got the one deck, you haven't got much reserve. You haven't got any reserve.
No, and that's the thing. The Royal Navy at that point is functioning without a reserve. It's lost all these ships. And if you think about it, I often think the biggest problem for the Royal Navy, and I sit there and I'm looking at it and I'm going, well, HMS Unicorn is being built, but she's become sort of the template for the light fleet carrier.
She's also delayed. She is delayed for 2 years as well.
Yeah.
So you're looking there at these 3 great ships, or potentially very, very useful ships, of course. But then again, you still got to feed the British Isles. So I can't understand.
And these are the ships. But I think what I'm sort of considering is that actually the escort carrier, the converted merchant ship to a carrier with the deck, is again not a new idea for the Royal Navy. They have had plans going around looking at it. Argus, of course, was the template for the model, and they had
Audacity was a great proof of concept.
Yes, so they had all these things. They had them sort of going around. What I often wonder is if, again, this is one of the big what ifs, and it comes back to the officers in charge, because when Henderson dies, there's a gap in the 3rd Sea Lord posting for a while, and until Bruce Fraser gets put in charge, and he sort of pushes on. But he's far less experienced than Henderson, and he's far less capable of pushing. And I wonder what the difference would have been if there had been either Henderson had handed over a year or 2 earlier to someone, so there was some more experience in the post of 3rd Sea Lord, and then Henderson was off in another fleet position when he died, or if he had lived a bit longer, and so you'd still had experience. Because I have a feeling, I'm not sure the carriers would have been stopped for 2 years. I think a way would have been found to keep them going while still supplying the Battle Atlantic. I have that feeling that they wouldn't have been stopped, because if there's one person who is the 3rd Sea Lords, not just Henderson, but even his predecessor, are drumming home the fact that the Royal Navy carriers are essential, they need to be built up, and their numbers need to be done. It's always the 3rd Sea Lords who seem to be making the case, and the 1st Sea Lords seem to be going after the battleships. If you look in the meetings, that's really what comes through. But also, I wonder if you might have found an escort carrier style production started a lot earlier to fill the cruiser carrier role, and that could be really interesting if you had a couple of those ships through, because they're quite quick to build. And if you think about what they'd have done in terms of freeing up assets for other things, they could have been really, really useful. Because you start off with a match, of course, and then you go.
This is where I've seen the counter argument for this one, and it makes a lot of sense. You've got to remember the loss rate in the Atlantic at this point.
Yeah.
You're losing so many more merchant hulls than you are building. That escort carrier is a luxury, which is why when one comes along unexpectedly, in the form of the captured German vessel that became the basis of the Audacity, that was the only opportunity, the first opportunity they had to actually put it into effect, because every other hull was committed to replace those lost hulls in the North Atlantic.
I agree, but I have a feeling the first ones, the conversions, if they had done it, and there would have been the compromise, would have been that we will build something on top of them that will not impact their ability to act as freighters, still be able to act as or tankers. Probably it would have been the tankers which have been converted. I'm guessing, considering that some of them were converted to LSGs, landing ship gantries, could well have been the Dale-class tankers which Henderson had ordered built in 1936, which were the big Dale-class, were the critical ones for fleet oil tanking and fleet tanking. I think a couple of them might have been converted. After all, some of them were converted to landing ship gantries with still their fuel intact so they could refuel ships on the task forces. Again, you could have gone, right, now, so we need this tanker to keep the escorts going across the Atlantic anyway. If we can build a gantry and landing craft, we can certainly build a flight deck over it, and we can build some sort of hangar underneath that flight deck. And it's going to sound funny, but I think the argument I would certainly see Henderson make, and you see made in the exercises in the interwar years, is certainly that, yes, it means one is slightly more limited in its value as a merchant ship, but the protection it would offer to the anti-submarine warfare, because remember, the Royal Navy's already been practicing airborne anti-submarine warfare since the First World War. The Spider's Web and all that scenario off the coast of the UK had been critical to anti-submarine warfare. For them, as far as the aircraft were part of anti-submarine warfare, even in the interwar years. So having aircraft there and having something which could interdict, enemy reconnaissance aircraft, so some fighters and some anti-submarine aircraft to sort of patrol and look for submarines on the surface, that seems a very useful asset, and it's an asset they can make the case for. I think there is a reluctance, though, to jump into it because in many ways the Fleet Air Arm Naval Aviation loses its prince at court when it loses Henderson. And then Lister comes back after Taranto, after various other things, and becomes that again as the Fifth Sea Lord. And then you start to have the movements going along in the escort carriers and these things. But you needed someone up there in the Admiralty who was prepared to make the case that, yes, we're at the coalface, yes, we're fine. But if we can get a better pickaxe, we can be so much more effective at the coalface. Mm. And the thing is, yes, we're losing merchant ships, but the two options we have to do is we can either try and build more, and we can never build as many as we are losing at the moment because it's going to take a while to start, or we can slow the number we're losing, or we can do both. And the thing is, it's best to attempt to do both. But we're never going to build enough to cover all our losses every month because we can't without the Americans getting involved in the Liberty Ship program. So honestly, option 2 is a very good thing to do to try and reduce your losses. But you need someone there who's going to sit there and go, we need to make this case. And the thing is, when Henderson goes, you don't have anyone there. Then you have Fraser comes in, and after Fraser's got comfortable in the Third Sea Lord's office, he's then gone off to command fleets and other things. So he's gone away to the home fleet, and the trouble is the Third Sea Lord's post is not a post you need someone experienced in it, because the trouble what they're doing is they are converting what the Director Naval Construction is designing into something which makes sense to the Naval Service, and are explaining what the Naval Service needs back to the Director of Naval Construction. And yes, DNC Stanley Goodall is excellent, and he's been in post for a long time by this point. He was appointed by Henderson, so he's been there for 6, so he knows what he's doing. But the trouble is, you need that Third Sea Lord. That Third Sea Lord is a very important post if you're going to be making this go back and forward.
Yes, well, look, no doubt about it. There's just so many things at that time, isn't there, playing on the minds of everyone.
Yeah.
You've got, where are you going to get the aircraft from? Where are you going to get the pilots from? Where are you going to get the ships from? Where are you going to get the workers from to do the modifications? It's easy to second guess. But I suppose getting back to carrier doctrine, to me, the embodiment of the whole design concept that you're talking about in terms of the carrier force, the Royal Navy's carrier force, comes into effect in the Indian Ocean in 1944. The raids against the various Japanese facilities in Malaysia, the Singapore Peninsula, and down into what we now know as Indonesia. That's where you have your multiple carriers, you operating in close concert with a battle group, and that battle group, when it's felt is appropriate, is used to do bombardment. So I see that as being finally, that's the one time, 1944, the Eastern Fleet starts out with Illustrious and Saratoga visiting, and then it sort of moves on to Illustrious and Atheling, the escort carrier, and then Illustrious and Victorious, and from then on you get Indomitable, Indefatigable turning up as well, and Formidable. No, Formidable doesn't turn up, but yeah, Formidable had stripped the main gear at this point and was ripping her armoured flight deck up in Gibraltar so that they could get it out to replace it.
Yeah, it's the other problem with an armoured flight deck. It does make, when you've got big parts down in the bottom of the ship, it is quite difficult to get to. Yeah, it's fun. There are flaws and against on all these things.
No, but you know, what do you think there is that correct premise that this is the high point of RN carrier doctrine?
Yes and no. It's both the high point in that they're getting to use the stuff and they're getting it unfettered. They don't have to deal with working with allies. They don't have to deal with all the pressures of that. But they also don't get to have the battle. So it's kind of like...
But are they looking for that big battle that you're talking about? Or are they looking at doing a different role, that punch, punch, punch below the belt where the carriers aren't?
They're looking at that role, yes. But there's always parts of the Royal Navy which would like the big battle.
Yes.
They prepare for a doctrine which is about fighting a war, but they still would like the battle.
Well,
they would like that battle.
Everyone wants to redo Jutland, don't they? So.
It's not so much to redo Jutland; it's to redo Trafalgar.
Yes.
Some of the enemy survived at Trafalgar. They don't want this to happen again. It's just terrible, terrible.
Yes.
But as I was saying, look, you've got it, and you have the fact. You know, I was doing a whole talk the other day on admirals, and that was quite a fun one. But the thing is, when you're looking at the admirals going backwards and forwards, you start realizing very quickly, when I was doing that research, just how scarce the Royal Navy comes for senior admirals who can run things out towards the end of World War II, because it's used them so much, and just how relatively junior the officers are being used, and even they are war-tired themselves. So when you realise that at one point, Lister Lumley is the same rank as Philip Vian, and Philip Vian is 6 years younger than him. And you think, post-war or pre-war, there wasn't that big a gap between officers of the same ranks. There were a few who were a bit of an outlier, but there wasn't that big a gap. And there were officers who were sort of bigger. You sort of sitting there going, this is the Royal Navy is really, you know, Philip Vian goes from being a captain in 1939 to a vice admiral by 1945. In peacetime Royal Navy, would be freaking amazing. That would be the kind of promotion level you'd be going, yeah, this guy is the second coming of Nelson. But in the wartime, Second World War, the Royal Navy is doing this. So you've got a lot of these officers coming through. They, you know, and they come up in the interwar period. They want that battle, not to necessarily refight Jutland, but because they want the battle for their generation. And there is, to an extent, some of them who are still a little bit upset with Operation C and how it went, because they do feel that was a missed opportunity. They do feel, you know, yes, as I said before, you can understand no one holds it against Somerville in terms of thinking him a bad man or anything like that. But he didn't do it. He didn't get it. He came so close and he didn't get it. And it's frustrating. It's not so much anger or upset with him or it's frustration that they didn't get to do.
Is this why it tends to get sort of shuffled under the carpet?
Oh, yeah. Look, the British have a great history. We tend to, when we're teaching military history, especially to our personnel, teach them our defeats. That's what we focus on. Other people look at victories. Historians look at our victories. But when we're teaching the armed forces, we focus on defeats. Operation C isn't either a defeat or a victory. It's a...
Yes.
It's a so close but not quite there. And you think, in nicest way, the Royal Navy doctrine of the 1920s and 30s was designed for that moment. Okay, we've only got 2 carriers. The enemy outnumber us 2.5 carriers to 1. They've got more battleships. They've got more this. They've got more that. What's our doctrine say? Hit them at night. Hit them hard when they can't fight back. And
he tried. He got that close.
He got to within 100 miles of them. And I know, but he doesn't go back and try again because once he learns how many of them there are. And that's the thing. He tries when he thinks they're the same number as him, which is fine. But anyone can fight a battle when you're fighting an enemy who's the same number as you. It's fighting a battle and winning when you're outnumbered. And that's what the Royal Navy likes to do.
Yeah. Hey, look, you know, the reason why Alex keeps talking about being British is because I'm Australian. And yeah, we're the ones who did their bidding at Gallipoli, so we're a little bit more skeptical of this approach.
To be honest, I'm very skeptical of Gallipoli as a whole thing. You know, for starters off, we told the enemy were coming. We told them where all their weak spots were, and then we turn up late. You know, it's bloody stupid, the whole of Gallipoli. But more than that, you know, you again, I have no the naval commander at the time. I can understand why he withdraws because he's losing ships. And he's losing big ships, and that's annoying. But the first time, but if he just kept going, he'd have probably made it through without many more losses. Or if he'd actually fought and brought some blooming minesweepers with him.
Well, and now they're all being scrapped, aren't they?
They didn't have minesweepers at the time. They did. They were trawlers. They were converted trawlers.
Yes.
They had a whole load sitting in the home fleet, and he didn't ask for any. I'll be back in a second. Someone's just calling for me. No. But as I've been trying to do in my landing ship and landing craft series, is point out that after Gallipoli, the Royal Navy and British didn't back off from amphibious warfare. They were very much still keen and interested in it and still developing it in these war years. But the thing is, very quickly, the reviews of Hamilton and all the stuff he got up to and of the timing is very much, you don't do this. And at one point, they're talking about putting a landing craft, of course, on commercial ships and merchant davits. But also, they start working out, I think it's not Warspite, it's one of her sisters, I think, or Queen Elizabeth. I think it could be Valiant, I'm not sure, though. Might have been Barham. But they basically try out testing launching them from a battleship. So the idea would be the battleship would turn up with the troops aboard. The troops would get dropped down off their davits, and she'd start to be providing bombardment. So basically, be rolling fun times.
So basically, you put up your sails so that the blast of the 15-inch guns can propel you towards the coast.
Possibly, but it's a case of.
But again, yes.
But the idea is basically that way a battleship could dash in, provide 5-inch and 4.5-inch and 15-inch fire support, and the troops could get in. And it was the commando raid was using a battleship.
Would have been a good one to see. That would have been a good movie. Yeah.
That would have been that is one that is, if it had actually happened, that would be one a movie would have been made about. Let's be honest. You tell a Hollywood producer, we've got a battleship.
Forget Cockle Show Heroes.
We've got a whole load of, and I think it might have been tested out. I think when it was tested out with some. I think it was part of the Indian exercises. I'm not sure though. I'm not 100% sure. I'm trying to think. But I think at the, you could imagine you could probably have some, if it was the Indian exercises, it would have been the Gurkhas, because of course they're the ones used for amphibious warfare practice out in the Indian Ocean. So you'd have had the Gurkhas and a battleship and an amphibious assault. Come on, that is gotta be a Hollywood movie.
Yes.
Think of how. In the nicest way, just imagine how many people would be beating down the door to get into that cinema.
Dunkirk, you're going nowhere.
Yeah, oh God, but no. Gallipoli.
Anyway, I think that's probably where we might wrap it up because we seem to be getting way off course here. We've gone from armoured carrier design to Gurkhas in the Indian Ocean on battleships.
They were fun. But no, carrier design. It's the operations. One of the things I'm always interested, because I love reading your site. As you know, I've used it shamelessly over the years to basically, whenever I need to argue a case.
And I shamelessly exploited your thesis that you shared with me as well.
Yeah,
so
yeah, that's fine. It works well. One of the things that I'm always interested in that you bring out in site is how many of the operations you're sitting there looking at and going, okay, right then, this is what we have. Let's go with it. And it is what they have to do. But you sit there and you think, that's basically also British pre-war doctrine. And I'm looking at the other navies in the world, and I'm not talking about the American and Japanese navies to this extent, but the Italian Navy and the German Navy and these things. I'm wondering if they missed that part in their doctrine. The idea of what do we have, let's go with it, versus the idea of we should have the perfect things here. We should have the perfect force.
One of the recurring things that I see in the veterans accounts that I'm reading and in the audio tapes now that I'm listening to from the IWM is this attitude of make, do, and mend, or just make and mend and make do. So I guess it's something that permeates from the lower deck to the upper deck, doesn't it? It's you do what you can with what you've got to the best of your ability. And I guess, that's why you send Formidable up to interdict the Stuka bombers, because they're pasting your evacuation forces coming out of Crete. You do that because you have to. You know that it's a risky move, but you do it. You do things like, you send 2 fleet carriers within single-engine fighter range of Sicily because you need to get that convoy through. And yet nowhere else will anyone willingly go within single-engine fighter range of a major opposing enemy force. So and again, why do they do it? Well, they had to. Malta was seen to be the linchpin of victory in the Mediterranean. It was how you choked Rommel, and it was how you springboarded into Italy. So, and that carries through. Why is Illustrious fighting off Sakashima Gunto, interdicting kamikazes on their way to strike the carriers off of Okinawa? Well, it's there with two engines, because the third one, the centerline one, was never the same after being bombed so many times off on Malta. But the carrier could still do 25 knots with 2. It needed 25 knots to launch its aircraft under most conditions, and that's where it was, doing its job because that's what it was expected to do. It's what you do with what you have.
And you do it, and you carry on, and you do it regardless. And this again is what comes back to Somerville, because this is the point. He makes the right decision, but if you look at all those decisions, if you look at Cunningham, Crete, Victorious, well, if you go from that, he's risking Victorious. You can make the argument that Victorious is a pretty important asset, and you're risking it for what? Evacuation of the army from Crete for this? Well, couldn't she just hang back a bit further and provide air defense for the troops trying to get out, and just do that? Why go forward? Why do the aggressive action to try and interdict? Why try to go for total victory when you could accept for her hanging back and providing air defense? But no, they went for total victory. They rolled the dice, because if they could have taken out those aircraft, there is the chance that actually, whilst you're still evacuating Crete, you might actually not lose other ships, but also you might be able to reinforce Crete instead of evacuate Crete, because you have the let up in the air attacks and let up things. So you might win Crete. So you're going for potential total victory at a high risk. Somerville stops a loss by going for the low risk option. You can accept it, you can understand it. But it's not really what the Royal Navy does.
All right. Well, I think we might leave it there.
Yeah, but I wanted to bring it back and win that point and make that point.
Yeah, I know. I'm just simply not as widely read, so I'm always happy to accept, these points of view because, it's a matter of knowing the whole context.
Very widely read, Jamie. Please
widely read on that narrow subject.
and this is the thing I would, it's going to sound strange, but this is the. It always feels weird in this scenario because I am younger than you, but if you were one of my master students, especially I get quite a lot of the mature ones who go in master's and PhD because I work quite well with them, and they seem to like me for some reason. I'm not sure why, but you would get the point of view as you have a lot of life experience, you've done a lot of studying, you know what you're talking about. Just have the confidence in you because you put forward some excellent points, and your website is amazing in that without it, a lot of the stuff which is argued online about armored carriers, about what they do, wouldn't have got where it's got because you've put together
that was always my intention.
That allows us to go to these because the traditional, nice way. I've done the work, but my book hasn't on aircraft. My PhD hasn't been turned into a book yet. It's going to be, but it hasn't been. Because when I was told I finished it, there's no way that's getting published. It's no. It doesn't fit with all the books that are coming out on carrier warfare, and they're all very American, Japanese centric. They're all this, and you're basically saying that no, there was another option, and actually the others come round to the other option by the end of the war because that is the option which makes sense for fighting a war rather than fighting a battle. And there just wasn't the space for that. Now there are such publishers after the Tribal Battle and Daring.
And look, that was my point because when I started looking at the carriers, it was coming from the perspective of reading fantastic books such as Inferno, and the books, whole set of books on Franklin and Bunker Hill and Ticonderoga, Intrepid. And because I'm Australian, we learned about the American naval battles, the ones that saved Australia, Coral Sea. We took part in a supporting role in many of the others, not Midway, but we were there at a lot of the other battles. So we always learnt about the U.S. Navy in our high school history classes. So in all these accounts, I kept on seeing these one or two sentences referring to the British carriers. Very much castaway lines, and some of them were castaway lines about how much damage Illustrious took in the battle for Operation Excess in Midway. And I just wanted to find out more about it. I thought, this sounds interesting. I really enjoyed these accounts of Franklin and Bunker Hill, the incredible fight against incredible odds that they experienced. And here they are teasing me about this similar incident that involved a British carrier that I'd never heard of before.
And imagine how different those books would have been if, with Operation C, if Somerville had done that. Right?
Yeah. You've made your point.
And of course, there were, if I'm not mistaken, there were Australian ships there. So
I don't know. Maybe. Oh yeah, Vampire. Yeah, Vampire was it? Yeah.
I'm not sure if there was a ship, but there's definitely Australian ship. Australian.
But this way, if Operation C had succeeded, I wouldn't have needed to write my website. So
Yeah. Well,
getting back to that point.
Let's be honest, the Americans tend to be better at publication than the British in terms of getting press. So you probably still need to write it, but it just gives the forgotten major battle which won the war.
It took me a couple of years to find this, which was the only book available about Illustrious and Operation. Otherwise, there was one more, which only touched on. It only actually gives one or two sentences per battle, but it very much explains the whole doctrine and development that you've been going into, the technical side. But actually finding out what happened to the ship and its crew was incredibly difficult. So.
When I was reading Norman Freeman, that's what started my PhD, because I have that book. I love that book, and I read through it and thought, this is great. But why are they going this technical route? You're going down they're not just randomly going on. There's got to be a reason for it. There's got to be something going on. And I kept getting there are these teasing lines about Henderson in it.
Mm.
And Henderson's actually a really strong character. You can tell that from the teasing lines in there. But there is so that's why I went and did my research, because I was going, what's happening? What's happening? And then you sort of go through it and go, oh my goodness me, the Royal Navy is going completely.
It's very similar for me as well, because after I get into Illustrious and what happened there, I'm hearing, hang on, something happened to Formidable. What? I had no idea that a carrier had been bombed during the evacuation of Crete. No idea whatsoever, and yet there it is. Sure, I'd heard all about Ohio. I'd heard all about the heavy losses sustained getting Operation Pedestal through to Malta, but nowhere had I encountered anything about the carrier fighter battle that took to get them within that final sprint of the island. And beyond that, who'd ever heard of the British Pacific Fleet?
Yeah.
And that's where because I couldn't find these books out anywhere myself, I just decided I'll gather all this information myself together in a way that I can go back over it later on and get the whole story. And ultimately, I got a bit annoyed with a few different recurring arguments on computer game websites and various other discussion forums about the very nature and role and war service history of these carriers, that I decided, well, okay, I'll put up a site, but not only would I put up a site, I'll put up a site with as much documentation as I can, so that people can read it for themselves and make up their own mind and not have to put up with me preaching at them.
Yeah. Whereas I enjoy doing the preaching. No, I enjoy something. With the trouble is, when you're starting to explain and trying to go into the Royal Navy in 1930s and 20s, the reason I went in that period is because the amount of people who basically jump from World War I to World War II and think that nothing happens in those interwar years, that the navies either stay stagnant and then suddenly they evolve all this stuff in World War II. And I sit there and go, the amount of books I've read where you would, honestly, the reader would come away with the impression that all this stuff suddenly appears in World War II as if by magic. And I, as you know, I've recently been looking into landing craft stuff, because I was asked a question online and I said, right, and I'll do a video. And I'll do it on landing ships. And it's exactly the same as reading the aircraft carrier stuff. This all magically appears in World War II, and you're going, no, it doesn't. Okay, yes, I do agree. The landing ships, quite a lot of them, the ideas are around prior to World War II, but they are pretty much designed in World War II. The only ones which you can directly.
Let's face it, they're very specialist. You're not going, not exactly something that you would think of putting in your fleet lineup in the 1930s.
Yes, but the landing craft, the smaller the ships which get the people to shore, they're very much around in the 1920s and 1930s. They are incredibly around in the 1920s and 30s, especially when you look at the ones which make up the vast majority of numbers. They basically, the design is the 1930s design, and it's just being churned out. And it makes sense, because you have a design which works. Why are you going to suddenly create a new design? Why?
Well, it takes longer. It's why you can't do anything new, because when you're required to do something new, you have to start from scratch. You have to go with what you have and modify it. Now that applies to any scenario. It's pandemic response. If you go with the war games of the pandemic response that you did 1 or 2 years ago, which I'm talking from Australia's experience here, and you adapt that to the situation at hand. You don't start it from scratch. And
in the British case, you go from the flu plans, because our plans were based on a pandemic flu. You work from them. It makes sense, because nicest way, trying to create all this stuff from scratch would take far longer and cost more in terms of lives. It might not be a perfect fit for the scenario you find yourself in.
That's right.
You have there.
Yes. And by the end of it, you've modified it into a perfectly appropriate, product.
Yeah.
So I think it's the same with, the ships. The way that you progress from Illustrious, which is a treaty design, through to Ark Royal Audacious, and you've got, you know, the epitome of going with what you've got, sticking to your guns with your doctrine, but refining it into you know, the perfect fighting machine. And I think you know, the Audacious gets pretty close to being that in terms of its you know, its size, its air group capacity, its endurance. It solves all those problems of the restrained treaty designs, but it still has all the advantages.
It's what's the Royal Navy. It's basically the dream, which, if you consider what was being, what Henderson and Goodall were sort of thinking about and were looking at, and would have dreamed of being done if they hadn't had the treaty limitations, or if the treaty arguments had gone the way they wanted. Because if you think about the size of the Audacious class, in Master's way, you don't actually have to add that much more onto the treaty limitations to really make it a viable design under the standard displacement rules. You could get 90% and 95% Audacious only on a couple of more thousand tons. So if they got what they wanted in terms of the carrier treaty tonnage, you know, and you sort of you sit there and go, well, that could have been the case, but it wasn't. And then you've got the illustrious.
No, I think it's also because they chose to go with an extra carrier, whereas they could have got a few extra 1,000 tons per carrier if they'd gone for one less ship. But you know, as you say,
again,
you get around the whole ocean.
If you're looking at a global war, you need numbers.
Yes.
And that's what the Royal Navy decision the Royal Navy makes with the cruisers. They basically go, we'll exchange heavy cruiser tonnage for light cruisers, and everyone's looking and going, oh, why are you doing this? This is going to damage your battle fleet. It's going to make you irrecoverably weaker. You can't do this. The Royal Navy going, no, we're quite happy to have the tonnage for light cruisers, thank you. And it makes sense for the Royal Navy because they're looking at fighting a global war where you need the numbers. You need to be there.
Yes.
You know.
All right. Okay. Anyone who knows how to set up a decent war game simulation, Operation C, you can find out the details on my website and let me know how it goes.
Oh, I think we'll have to get Drac involved for that. And for those who don't realise, Drac, of course, is our third compadre for the Bilge Pumps podcast series, which will start coming out as soon as we manage to get one that records properly.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Have a good day, and happy Mother's Day to you over there. It isn't over here, but happy Mother's Day. Hope they've had a good time. Go and now you've spent 2 hours talking to me. I think you should probably go focus to.
Yeah, you're gonna have to cut this back to at least 1 hour. Okay.
No. We'll keep it for 2 hours. It'll be fun.
See you then.
Take care.
Bye.